Welcome to Aquarian Diary, where we discuss issues around the emerging age of Aquarius. I'm your host, John Irving. Thank you for joining me. Greetings all. It is October 25th, 2022. Apologies again. I have a cold, so my voice is not in its normal state, and I sound quite a bit flat here, but that's just because it's that time of year. In this episode, I want to talk about something that I've been looking forward to talking about for a very long time. And namely, that is transcendence versus spiritual bypassing. First of all, let's define those terms. I'm going to use my own definition for these terms. Other people may define them slightly differently, but for these purposes, I think my definitions will suffice. Transcendence is the ability to experience a higher state of being or consciousness that may be significantly higher than your normal state of consciousness. Now, this can occur randomly, or it can occur through some deep spiritual practice or devotion, or it can occur by grace. Some people have experienced enlightenment spontaneously, where it suddenly just occurs unexpectedly. So we can go from one state of consciousness into a much higher state of consciousness in a very short period of time, potentially. Now, whether or not we stay at the higher level of consciousness, whether it can be sustained, is the question. And spiritual bypassing is typically understood to be when people engage in spiritual activities or routines or habits as a means of avoiding dealing with practical or pragmatic issues. Typically, they would be psychological in nature, but I define that a little more broadly. It could be using spirituality or the guise of spirituality to avoid dealing with deeper, more systemic problems. In effect, some people can use the pursuit of spirituality as a crutch and a means of avoidance. It's worth noting that I have observed that within spiritual communities, there are quite a few people who aren't actually spiritual seekers, but they just want to be around to be part of a community. So for social reasons, for example. I've seen that quite a bit. Of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be in a community. However, they are different agendas. And it can get pretty awkward when you're doing spiritual work with someone who's just pretending in order to be accepted, assuming their motivations are discerned, which quite often is not the case, surprisingly. Nonetheless, my point is that it's not really fair to criticize these people for engaging in spiritual bypassing. Now, why is this an important topic? I myself have had many, what I would describe as transcendent spiritual experiences in my life, starting when I was a young person. And during my early 20s, I had what I would describe as many very powerful spiritual experiences, which were completely outside of the paradigm in which I grew up in. In fact, there was no one even remotely in my familial or childhood environment that I had communicated with about these kinds of things at all. So that in itself was kind of a little bit remarkable. It was probably not until I was 18 or 19 that I was exposed to any esoteric knowledge or information at all. This was way before the dawn of the internet, of course. However, there is another thing which is known or described as a peak spiritual experience, which many people have had, if not many of them, which is where we have a very powerful spiritual experience that stands out from our normal state of being and can be something that we can recall and focus on for many years, if not the rest of our life afterwards. We can have these very powerful experiences that are out of the norm for us, that can have a very profound effect on us and our awareness. So as a result of having these kinds of experiences, I assumed that it would be possible for me to achieve and sustain a state of consciousness like that on an ongoing basis. So then extrapolating from all this, there's this question of whether we can have an evolutionary leap in consciousness, to use the metaphor of driving a car, where suddenly you go from driving 10 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour. And in the case of sustained transcendence, you would maintain that faster speed indefinitely. But what often happens is that we find that our own flaws or shortcomings or weaknesses undermine us and drag us back down to our more normal state of consciousness, or maybe a few notches above where we used to be before we have these powerful spiritual experiences. So it's a bit like a two-step forward, one-step back kind of process, or it can be. Because in order to maintain a higher state of consciousness, you basically have to have mastered or cleared a lot of your baggage. Things like fear, negativity, doubt. Because we are sensitive, even your environment and the people that you are around and the places that you are in can lower your energy back down and pull us back into a lower state of consciousness. Now, like I said, because I have had many experiences like this, I always had this thought or belief that I could transcend, that I could basically make a giant leap forward in one fell swoop in terms of my consciousness, and that I ideally could maintain that. But like I said, reality has a way of bringing us back down into a more normal or maybe slightly advanced state of awareness. It's not necessarily a linear process, in other words. And so the question then arises, is transcendence really possible? Or is this belief just a form of spiritual bypassing and wishful thinking, where as a result of these kinds of experiences, we sort of delude ourselves into thinking that we can achieve a higher state of consciousness and maintain it without doing our shadow work, for example. Now, I happen to believe that both are true because I have had some very powerful transcendent experiences. I recognize that that is possible, but I also know from personal experience that what happens when we get into a higher state of consciousness is that everything about us becomes magnified, including our shadow issues. So if we don't do our shadow work, or we have remnants of shadow stuff within us, it also becomes amplified and can present itself very dramatically and viscerally to you. And a great deal of our darkness can be unconscious or subconscious or repressed, because often it is perceived to be negative or undesirable in nature or even sinful. It is very common for it to be simply repressed or denied. So it could be things like from your infancy or even from past lives, things that you're not even aware of normally. I have had this experience of being around enlightened people on a few occasions, and your shadow can become extremely apparent to you very dramatically when you are in the presence even of an enlightened being. I've had that experience multiple times in multiple ways. So the light itself has a way of magnifying your awareness of all of your energies, good and bad. So although I recognize that transcendence is possible, I also recognize that if we have unresolved karmic baggage, wounding, darkness, doubts or insecurities, trauma, fear is a very powerful one, stuff like that within us, it will trip us up and bring us back down into a lower state of consciousness. So it's like we can only climb as high and sustain it as our energy allows us. And we have to go back and continue to clear our darkness as it emerges in order to manifest significant amounts of light on an ongoing basis in a steady state. And this is something I have debated literally since I was in my early 20s. In fact, back then, I would often debate with my friends about whether or not we should be mucking around with psychology and psychological issues at all, because I felt that by doing so, we were avoiding transcendence and that we could literally transcend all of those kinds of matters simply by becoming more spiritually focused. So this has been a big topic for me personally, and I wanted to talk about it here just to get people thinking about this, because I think as the light is increasing here on Earth, more and more people are going to be grappling with this kind of a thing. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, when you shine light on something, the shadows become a lot more obvious. The brighter the light, the more contrast. So a lot of people think we're going through this process of ascension on Earth, and suddenly we're all going to be happy and lovey-dovey and everything's going to be beautiful. But as we can see what's happening in the world right now, as I record this, is that the darkness is becoming extremely evident all around us. It's in our faces very powerfully. So we have to do the shadow work so that we can embody and hold higher states of consciousness, more light. It's kind of a prerequisite. Yes, I also still believe that it's possible for some people to experience a great leap forward in their consciousness and to maintain that through things, like I said, like grace. Sometimes it's linked to astrology transits. Sometimes these shifts of consciousness are baked into our life plan. Sometimes these individuals have done a tremendous amount of work in prior lives. But generally, what I'm saying about the darkness is absolutely true. It has to be, at the very least, purged, if not resolved and dealt with, in order for you to achieve and maintain a higher state of consciousness. That's why I'm titling this Transcendence versus Spiritual Bypassing. It's something I think people need to be aware of, and I think it's something we need to be talking about. And like I've said before, I spend an awful lot of time and energy doing shadow work, and I can assure you that it is extremely rewarding and beneficial and powerful. It's not necessarily easy, but I would recommend it to anyone. I will put some links in the episode description for how to connect with me in various ways. I really appreciate your likes. That helps me. Your subscribes, of course, your sharing of this. And please do read the comments, because some people make some really fabulous comments on my episodes, and some people put quite a bit of thought and effort into crafting them. And it's really interesting to see the caliber of comments that some people are making. And I just want to draw your attention to that. Thanks for everything. Take care. We're in the middle of eclipse season. Hold on to your hats. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.